Okay, Alexis, I'm going to run through this quickly, so you're just getting the highlights, but I would encourage you to go and talk to Brandon or come to my office hours to sort of clarify some of the things that you missed. But I'm going to start with last Wednesday and work my way through today. So reasoning patterns we had learned at that point was understanding the nature of science, understanding that science is agnostic, right, that it's without belief, and then basing our faith in God on the correct evidence, not on gaps, so a God of the gaps. And so then we got into pseudoscience, and in the book it talked a lot about pseudoscience. I think it went through the MMR story, the MMR with Wakefield and autism, and it went through the Lysenko and the genetics in Russia that killed a bunch of people. We talked about these two, like the Creation Museum that's got a person with a dinosaur, and then the universal model, which is an incorrect view of science that has water on the inside of the earth. So that's where Noah's floodwaters went, and the idea is that it's giving people an alternative to science so that they don't lose their faith. And so we talked about what pseudoscience is, being fake science, but more importantly, we talked about the motivation for teaching it. And the idea is a lot of times it's not nefarious, the motivation. The motivation really is that they don't feel like students can handle the real science, and so they need to invent an alternative that will allow students to, like in this case with these two, to read the Bible literally and not lose their testimony. But the danger in that is that the science is out there, and especially now with the touch of a button or the just, shouting, "Hey Siri," you can get all this information. And so trying to teach them something false is setting them up for failure. And so then we talked about how do we find accurate information. So, as the question for this lesson is, what are the key reasoning patterns for finding truth? Well, we need to be aware of what information there is. So if you want to take a minute and scan this QR code, you can go to this article and read it, but I'll give you the short of it. Basically, the authors are claiming that cardio is bad for women, that cardio increases your stress levels, which increase your cortisol, which causes your body to store fat and gain weight. And it turns out it's not true. And when you look at the citations he cites, some of the links are broken, but some of them, when he goes to the citation, it's not relevant. Like it's on elite athletes who are men, and it's on people who are doing extreme workouts, not their normal cardio routine, and it's looking at cortisol levels just within 1 hour of workout, not prolonged cortisol levels. So when he makes a statement that exercise can increase your cortisol levels, that's a true statement, but it's not in context of women running and doing cardio, right? So we talked about how the source has to be appropriate to what you're talking about. And so we talked about the types of sources first. Primary sources are ones that where, the person doing the experiment has actually reported it, but more importantly, it's peer reviewed. So the idea is, and I go through this all the time, right, that when I do a research project, I write up a paper and then I send it to a journal and they send it out to experts in the field who then tear it apart, right, and tell me all the things I need to change or modify or better explain. And so it gets reviewed multiple times. Now, this doesn't totally prevent junk from getting out there, but it's a really good filter. And so that's what makes something a primary source. It's published and peer-reviewed, and it's by the author who actually did the study. Secondary are things like textbooks or popular news articles or review papers where they're gathering a whole bunch of primary literature and they're like synthesizing it. And they can be good or they can be bad, right? Some of the secondary literature, like coming out of the New York Times or CNN, can maybe misquote the primary literature. So you have to be a little bit more leery about secondary sources. And then anecdotal is by far the most common source that people consume, especially today. Anecdotal, an anecdote is a personal story. So anything you read on social media is just people's anecdotes. And just because there's 100 anecdotes that say the same thing, it doesn't actually constitute data. You actually need to do a controlled experiment, publish a paper, primary article. The other thing to keep in mind is what we call the CRAP test. So when you're looking at articles, you look at how current they are, right? So sometimes things change, especially with like COVID. I trust a source that was published in 2024 more than I trust a source that was published in 2019 because the COVID pandemic has changed and shifted over time. Relevance, like we were talking about with the runner, that it has to be relevant to the particular topic you're talking about. Hold on one second. Excuse me. Authority is who is the source of the information? Are they credible? Do they have the right credentials? So we talked about how a lot of times people who maybe have an MD in front of their name or doctor in front of their name, sometimes they're not the right doctor. So they might be like a doctor of humanities and they're making claims about evolution. That would be inappropriate, right? Not the right authority. Accuracy, reliability, and correctness. So this is if you see this over and over again in reliable sources, then maybe it's accurate. And purpose is looking for that agenda, right? What's the reason that the information exists? Do they have an agenda? Do they have a bias about the information that they're putting out there? So the CRAP test is just kind of a fun way to remember it. I'm going to have you watch this video on your own. So if you want to pause and look at the URL, type it in, watch it. It's really great. And it talks about a double-blinded, randomized, controlled placebo trial. And he'll kind of define those terms, like a placebo is a fake treatment. What does it mean to be randomized, controlled, double-blind? Okay, so go ahead and watch that video to get some of those terms on your guide. And by the way, you can find all of the guides as one full PDF online on Canvas.
You can't try.
Okay, and then we talked about the deficit model. So we ran this experiment in my lab. The deficit model is the idea that, and people do this all the time, where scientists assume that if someone doesn't accept the science, like if they don't accept evolution or they don't accept vaccines, that they're somehow less intelligent, that they have a deficit in something. And so we actually ran this study to look at the relationship between religiosity, so you can read what that is, and then belief in non-scientific creationist ideas about the Earth, like the Earth is less than 10,000 years old or something like that, and then evolution acceptance. And then we looked at people's science IQ, the scientific reasoning ability test that you guys took. And then we looked to see what the relationship was. And so if you were a deficit modelist, you would say that as your scientific IQ goes up, then maybe your religiosity would go down. Your belief in non-scientific ideas would go down. And then if your scientific reasoning goes up, your acceptance of evolution would go up. And so what we actually found is that there is a positive relationship here. So the more religious you are, the more likely you might have come in contact with and accept these non-scientific creationist ideas. And the more that you accept these ideas, the less you accept evolution. So that's a no-brainer. But what's the relationship with science IQ? And it turns out there isn't one. There's no relationship. You can be really, really smart and still reject evolution. You can be really, really dumb and accept evolution. The idea is that there's not a relationship. It's not a deficit. We're oftentimes hesitant to accept science for other reasons. And they did the same thing with climate science. So they looked at science literacy. This is kind of another kind of smartness test, your numeracy, your science literacy. And they predicted that if you have low science literacy, then you're going to accept climate change less. And if you have high science literacy, you'll accept climate change more. And what they actually found is this. So again, this is not significant. It doesn't matter. It's not a numeracy literacy issue, right? It's more of a worldview issue. So avoiding a deficit model is one of those reasoning patterns that we want to avoid. That we want to do. We want to avoid a deficit model. Okay, so that was Wednesday's class. We'll go ahead and roll right into, and you had to do the pseudoscience and the deficit model. Friday's class, we did an activity called Vaccine Skeptics. These are the things that you're going to write about. And this is I'll give you the short of the vaccine skeptics. Okay, so the general idea, and I'm going to get all the details, that science is a conversation, right? That it changes over time, and despite our best efforts of it being totally sterile, it is influenced by who's doing the science, where we're doing the science, when we're doing the science, and it tends to change over time as we get more information and more data. It's an ongoing conversation. So this is a story of the vaccine skeptics of 1721. And so I'll just jump to vaccine issues have been around for a long time. This is COVID today, but look back in 1802. this was a political ad against vaccines that on cowpox, and they were showing all these people growing cows off their body if they got the vaccine. But way back in 1772, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, she was the wife of an ambassador, and they were in Istanbul. And in Istanbul, she noticed that none of the people were getting smallpox, and they had really beautiful skin. So she had a really pocked face because she had survived smallpox just a couple years before. And she was noticing that these people were really healthy. And then she learned of this custom that they were doing in Istanbul. The old women would go around and they would scrape pustules of people who had smallpox, and then they would like grind it into your skin and give you like this mild form of smallpox, and you would build up immunity. So it was basically like a vaccination, and they were doing it in the baths in Istanbul, in Constantinople. And so Lady Mary was really concerned about her son. This is her son who's 5, and she didn't want her son to die of smallpox. And so she wanted to get her son vaccinated in Istanbul. But it was like this kind of, how do you decide if this is credible? Here you are in another country with another culture. They're not Christian. They're totally different from you. All you've seen is the outcome, and you've heard stories of what they're doing. How do you trust them? Like, what counts as evidence or sufficient evidence at the time? Can you trust these people? Who's an expert? These old women who are scraping your skin? Are they experts? And so in her day and age, it was really hard to decide who was an expert and who wasn't. And who to believe and who not to believe. And so she consulted with the physician that had gone with them on the trip and decided that she wanted to vaccinate her kid. But she didn't have the old woman do it. She had her physician do it. And he went ahead and did it, and the son never got smallpox, so it was successful. And so she goes back to England, and she's like talking this up to everyone, like everybody should be doing this. But she's writing under a pseudonym. She's like signing her papers as a man because she didn't want anybody to know who she was, and she wanted to be taken seriously. And people were really skeptical. They're thinking this came from like these heathen people in Istanbul, and should we really accept that? And Charles Maitland, she wants her daughter to be vaccinated, and the doctor is like, ooh, I don't think, they were calling it variolation at the time. I don't think I'm going to do it. So the doctor refuses to do the daughter because they're now back in England. So why is the decision more difficult? The idea being that now we're in England, and the reputation of Maitland is at risk. The stakes are higher. He's being seen by people that know him. He's doing something that's kind of foreign. And so he decides to go to Hans Sloane, who's like the president of the National Academy of Sciences or whatever or National Academy of Physicians in England. And Hans Sloane says, okay, let's do this. So they vaccinate the daughter, and she does well and is fine. And so then she goes to her cousin or friend, I can't remember if it's cousin or friend, the Princess of Wales, Caroline, and says, hey, you should vaccinate your kids because it's working so well. But the stakes are way higher now. So Caroline is married to the king. So these are the offspring of the king. Should that change the evidence? Well, obviously in an ideal world, that should not change the evidence. But in this case, she's like, yeah, it changes the stakes. The stakes are higher. And now all of a sudden, Charles Maitland's not necessarily an expert, and the physician's guy is not necessarily an expert. And what would it require to convince them that this is really a good thing? And so we kind of talked about that as a class, like that, it really shouldn't change what the evidence is or what's deemed acceptable, but it does, unfortunately. And so what they ended up doing was going to a prison, and they found 6 people who were on death row, and they offered them, they get their slate swiped clean and they get to go if they'll allow them to vaccinate them. And then there was one woman among these 6, and the woman was also purposely exposed to smallpox. And everybody was healthy, right? And it worked. But then Caroline is like, well, that's adult. Does it work on kids? And so then they went to an orphanage where they didn't have to get permission, and they used the orphans as guinea pigs to vaccinate them and see if it worked. And lo and behold, luckily, it worked. And so then that was evidence enough for the king to vaccinate his daughters, but not his sons. All right, so he vaccinates the daughters, not the sons. And so should gender matter? Well, no, but it does in this case because science is often influenced by the signs of the times. And then it is this like big debate in the scientific literature. Some people are mocking people for doing it, other people are praising it, and it goes back and forth because it is a conversation, right? We're learning and we're putting out opinions and we're putting out data and trying to figure it out. So what other things might influence judgment? Well, we talked about gender, culture, religion, just psychology, just fear, right? So this is what smallpox does to you, right? So if you're vaccinated, you get this really mild case. If you're not vaccinated, it can be potentially lethal and very disfiguring. So there were several other epidemics of smallpox that broke out before England finally instituted vaccination, but then it took a long time for it to catch on. So we just talked about like, how do we judge good information? How do we try to avoid falling to the temptation of using gender or race or political ideology in our decisions about what makes good science and what doesn't, and trying to stick to the crap test, trying to stick to what is actual primary sources. Okay, so that was our vaccine hesitancy lesson on Friday, and you had to model. That was day 3, or I'm sorry, that was not 30, and scholarship is conversation. So that was Friday. Okay, so then today we did statistics. Now this is a bit of a challenge to do over this video because it's rather extensive, but you can kind of follow along. We talked about big S science versus little s science, which is in the book, so you can read about that. And then we went back to the burying beetle, so you can kind of follow along on your student guide for today, and I'm going to look at it too so I can remember what we did. So if you look at number 1 on your student guide, we went back to the burying beetles. If you remember, they had little mites on their heads, and the researchers decided that the mites were a source of heat, and that's what was influencing the winning battles. And so then we talked about the null hypothesis. So when we do science, it's this idea that we presume innocence until you're proven guilty. So we presume that nothing is going on, that nothing actually is influencing the results, that our hypothesis is wrong. And then it's our burden as the researchers to prove otherwise. So we actually technically start with a null hypothesis. That null hypothesis being that the heat doesn't matter. It's really not the heat. The fights are always fair. That's the null hypothesis. Okay. And so as a reminder, their experiments, they had treatment 1, treatment 2, and treatment 3. You can pause this video and read those. And then they looked at how many times they won the fight. So I asked students on number 2, you can see if you flip the page, there's 2 pictures where you make hypotheses about what it should look like. So in the first one, if our hypothesis really is correct, then you should see the one that's warmer winning more battles and the one that's colder not winning as many battles. But if our null hypothesis is correct, so that second set of graphs, you should see a 50-50 shot, right? They should win equally. And so that's what you should fill in there for 2. And I would encourage you to pause and do that on your guide. Okay, so then when they actually did the experiment, this is what they see, right? We saw this before, that indeed the warm ones won more battles, the cold ones won less battles. But the question is that different enough? Like, so we had a 15-5 ratio. What about if it was 14-6 or 13-7 or 12-8? And as a class, we kind of started going, I don't know if it's different enough at 12-8 or 13-7. So there's got to be like a cutoff point where we decide it really is different enough. And so the way that we do that is actually mathematical. So I had the students come up with some kind of formula for how far off they are from the expected 10-10. So we start with our null hypothesis that it's a fair fight. They should win 10-10. And so this 15-5 is 5 off, right? And so then I had the students, if you look at number 6, I had the students look at that far off score that you made in number 4, that formula of like 10 is what we should win minus whatever we did win. In fact, let me see if I can draw on this. Yeah. So we said here was our far offness score. We did 10 minus however many battles they actually won, so it would be 15, right? And then we did an absolute value, so it was always a positive number. And we said, in this case, if it was 15 battles that they won, then they would be far off by 5. They were 5 off from what we expected from a fair fight. This value of 5, this is called a statistic. So you plug in whatever your numbers are and you get out a statistic. So then on this sampling distribution that you see on your paper on number 6, I asked them, and let's see if I can get a blank slide. Yeah, I can. Oh, no, I can't. Oh, hold on. I'm just going to add a blank slide so I can draw here. Okay. I'm sorry, on that distribution you see. So I have this thing drawn where it says, here's my statistic along the x-axis, and then this is the probability of getting it. So we decided that if we use our formula of 10 minus whatever we actually got in wins, that's our weirdness score. So if it was a 50-50 fight, 10-10, our value would be 0, right? If one won all of them, so 20-0, then this value would be 10. So if we ask everybody at BYU, all 35,000 students, to get these beetles and battle them 20 times, and then plug their number into the statistic, what's the distribution we would get if it really was a fair fight, right? So if it's a fair fight, it should be mostly 0 or maybe 1 off or 2 off. And in fact, there's a slightly higher probability of being 1 off, because you can be 1 off in the positive direction or 1 off in the negative direction, than being 0. So it kind of looks like this, that distribution you see on the paper. Okay, it looks like that. So it's almost impossible to get a 10 by chance alone, to have that one beetle win 20 battles, even though they're fair. More likely to be just 1 or 2 or 3 off. So that's what we drew on 6. And then we said, okay, how far off, when do we start getting uncomfortable that, ooh, this isn't a fair fight? 10-10, we're good. 11-9, 12-8, 13-7, that's when people started going, I think maybe it's a little bit unfair. Like if we get up to 7, right? Then we're thinking, ooh, that's kind of unfair. So we've set ahead of time and said anything past that mark is too weird. And we're going to say, no, I think it's too weird. And so we set this value ahead of time. It's actually the area under the curve. So all the space under the curve, how much is that space? And we decided it was 5%. So that is what we call our alpha value. It's how much risk we're willing to take that it really was just a weird thing, like random chance, and we thought it was actually doing something. Okay, that's our alpha value, and it's standard to set it around 5%. So 0.05. Oh, that's a really ugly 0 and a really ugly 5. Okay, so then let's say we run the battle and we get, let's say we get one beetle wins 18 battles, right? So then we'd have 10 minus 18, absolute value, that would give us 8. Okay, so that value is going to fall right here. So then you'd say, how much area is in this? Well, it's less than 5%, right? So that is our p-value. It's what the area actually is wherever our statistic falls and to the right. So this maybe is like, I don't know, 4%. And then we'd say, oh, heat really does matter, okay? And so that's how we figure out, this distribution is called a sampling distribution. We set our alpha value, and then we actually run the test, figure out where our statistic falls, and then decide what the p-value is. So then we went to this table and we said, all right, let's do our null hypothesis. Whoops, let's escape out of here. Hello, escape. Just go to here, this table. We're going to fill it out together because we did that in class. And we said, okay, so our null scientific hypothesis that heat doesn't matter. If heat doesn't matter and we run warm and cold beetles against each other, right, then we should see a 50-50 outcome, right? They should win 50% of the battles. So then the statistics say, if it really is a fair fight, i.e. any differences we see are just chance events. They don't actually mean anything. If we do that, differences we see, okay, if we do that and we run or we calculate our statistic, our weirdness score, then it should fall to the left of alpha. So in our distribution, it should be far within the sampling distribution. It should not be out in the tail. But if it is out in the tail, then we can reject our null hypothesis and say, you know what, heat probably matters. Okay, now I realize statistics is tricky, right? So if that didn't make sense, I would love for you to come in and talk to me or talk to Brandon and get this cleared up, because we're starting into more heavy content and I need you to get this down. So if you end up missing Wednesday and Friday, please let me know and I will try to do another video. Hope you're feeling better.